Hello, today is the first video in a series where I review the Spanish of non-native speakers on YouTube. During these videos, I will dig deep and focus on even the smallest details to analyze what the best speakers get right and what they could still improve on to push to the most advanced levels. Hopefully, this will be useful to both learners who are looking to improve their Spanish and also the more general viewers who want to get a good idea of how good these non-native speakers really are. Quick disclaimer, this is by no means a criticism and is purely made for learning purposes. With that being said, let's get on to today's review. Today I'll be reviewing Spanish with Rors. Now this is a channel I came across a few months back, and he comes across as very genuine and also has a very good level of Spanish. The video I'll be reviewing is titled The Best 4 Days of My Life in Peru. Now his level is very good, so what this means is that I'm going to be extremely picky and probably not able to cover a large portion of his video, but the part I do cover will be covered in a lot of detail. So, the first thing I wanted to look at was the title of the video. Of course, the main title is in English. However, the title on the thumbnail, which is the translation of the English title, Los mejores 4 días de mi vida, is in Spanish. And this title is not quite the most natural way of putting this. So, the more natural way in Spanish would be Los 4 mejores días de mi vida. Instead of separating the adjective and the noun, it's better to put the number before both of them. Alright, so let's start looking at the video.
Hola a todos, hoy les voy a explicar sobre mis experiencias en el camino Inca.
Alright, I know I'm not going to speak too much at once, but I wanted to go through the details which I've heard from the first sentence. So he says, Hola a todos, hoy les voy a explicar sobre mis experiencias en el camino Inca. Right? But when he says les voy a explicar, it sounds too strong. It says les voy a explicar, right? And that's not what we want. We want the V to be quite soft, much softer than it is in English. Similar to is between two vowels, when in this case we don't have two vowels, but we have the S and we have a vowel following it. So that's also another situation where we would have the soft V. Also, when he said mis experiencias, there is a few different things. So when he said mis, he pronounced the S as a sonorized S. So that what that means is he was vibrating the vocal cords at the same time, like a Z in English. So mis experiencias. But since here the S is between two vowels, it should be just a clear S, like it is most of the time in Spanish. So mis experiencias, not mis experiencias. And the other thing was with when he pronounced the E vowel, the first E sounded a bit like an I. And additionally, the A at the end was reduced to a schwa when we have a sound, which is what we do with majority of the vowels that aren't stressed in English. We reduce them to a schwa, like a. And that's what happens quite commonly to English speakers when we speak another language. We bring this over and we reduce some of the vowels, even though in the other language this shouldn't really happen. So instead of experiencias, as it sounds like when he is doing it, it should be experiencias with a clear A and a clear E in the middle. Additionally, he was using ceseo, so he pronounces le C and le S are the same. So this is not the most common way of speaking in Spain, but it is the most common way of speaking Spanish in most of the countries which are Spanish speaking. Perfectly fine, just something to observe. With Camino Inca, there are a couple of things that we can observe. So the C sound, the K sound, in English is much more aspirated. So when we say it, it sounds like a k with lots of air coming out. Now, when you're saying camino, it wasn't quite as aspirated as we normally do it in English, but it was a bit too much aspiration compared to what is expected in Spanish. So he was somewhere in the middle between English and Spanish. So the most important thing to do is make sure that when you're pronouncing the ka in Spanish, there's no air that comes out at the same time. So you should put your hand in front of your mouth like this, or a piece of paper or something, and see how much air is coming out. And camino, not camino. And the same thing with Inca. The C in Inca, it sounded like Inca, Inca. And additionally, the vowels sounded quite like in English. And I think this is because it's, well, a name, and it's a name that exists in both the languages, but in this case is important to pronounce consistently with the rest of your speech. So even though it's a name, it should be pronounced as it is in the same language that you're speaking. So if you're speaking Spanish, you pronounce Inca as a Spanish speaker would. Of course, names of people, this may not be the case, and it might be better to change to the pronunciation of the language which the name is from. If you know it, that's perfectly fine, but in this case it's a name which exists in both languages, so it's better to be consistent. And this is further reinforced when he says camino Inca. But so if you notice, between the two vowels there is a gap and there is a glottal stop when he does it. So camino Inca. Instead of this, normally in Spanish, this does not happen. What happens instead is the vowels sort of flow into each other. Camino Inca. So oi is, even though they're two separate words, they're kind of still joined up. There's no gap in the middle. There's no stopping of the air like in English. That's maybe just one thing he's got to work on. Make sure that he's consistent even through the things that seem like names. Okay, so commenting a bit on the grammar of this phrase, les voy a explicar sobre mis experiencias, is probably more natural since you're not necessarily explaining your experiences to someone. You don't have to justify your experiences. So it's more natural to say you're telling someone about your experiences or you're speaking to someone about your experiences. So in this case, a more natural way in Spanish would be perhaps les voy a contar mis experiencias o les voy a hablar de mis experiencias. Let's look at the next part of the video.
Cómo conseguí el apodo Gringo Importa o porteador gringo y cómo eso pasó.
So here there's a couple of things. Coming back to what I said before about the glottal stops and the flowing of vowels, it's very important to make sure that the vowels flow into each other, even between words. So he said, como conseguí el apodo, rather than como conseguí el apodo. So between conseguí and él, it should be conseguí él, not conseguí él. There shouldn't be any gap or any blockage of air using the glottal stop in the middle. The same thing with como eso pasó. There shouldn't be any gap here either. It should be como eso pasó. Additionally, when he said portador gringo, with the word gringo, it sounded more like gringo, which is using the English sound. So the in English doesn't really exist in Spanish. Instead, there's just the sound. So the tongue's further back and it's slightly more closed with the lips more widened, like rather than E is more of a central vowel. So when he said gringo, it should be more like gringo. A couple of grammar points. So when he said como conseguí el apodo, when using the word conseguir, it sounds like he was trying to get this nickname. When in fact it's clear from the context that they just gave him this nickname. He wasn't initially expecting to get the nickname. It's just something that he earned or got after he did something. Instead, a more natural way of putting it would be ¿Por qué me pusieron el apodo Gringo Porter? And additionally, when he's leading into the next part, como eso pasó, he says, firstly, this would be esto instead of eso, and when we're emphasizing it in English, we say how this happened, and then we show what happened, right? In Spanish, you don't necessarily keep the same word order and then stress the word that's important, that this happened. Instead, you bring the most important thing to the end of the sentence, como pasó esto, and then you show the thing that happened, right? So, y como pasó esto. It's a more natural way of leading in to showing what happened by putting esto at the end to show there's something coming afterwards. Next sentence.
Fue una de las cosas más difíciles que he hecho en mi vida y la verdad es que el hecho de que ustedes lo hacen todos los días y luego preparan todo esto para nosotros es algo que...
Okay, so I want to say first of all, this part is very natural and very good pronunciation throughout, especially the consonants, and clearly was a stressful situation even, like with talking to the whole group of people at the same time, and as well with the camera recording. So very well done with that. It's just a couple of points. So when he said, el hecho de que ustedes, the que, again aspirated the ka sound, or in this case the que sound, sounded more like a ke. So we've got to make sure that we don't have the air coming out as much as we do in English. Additionally, when he says es algo que, it sounds more like es algo que, using the English So the difference between the English and the Spanish is that this English is more open. So the tongue is further down in the mouth when you're using the English one, and also further forwards. And so in order to produce the Spanish sound, we need to move our tongue backwards and also slightly up to block a bit more of the air coming out of the mouth. So que, e is the correct, but que is the less correct version, or the more English version. And he doesn't do this all the time, which is good. It's just something to consider, trying to make sure all his vowels are consistent throughout the entire time he's speaking in Spanish. Okay, so analyzing a bit the grammar of this section. So he says, la verdad es que el hecho de que ustedes lo hacen todos los días y luego preparan todo esto para nosotros es algo que, here, the main problem is that he should have used the subjunctive. El hecho de que normally is followed by a subjunctive. And you say a word, this el hecho means the fact, right? So the fact that, and when we're talking about facts, we should therefore use indicative. This is a bit misleading, since we are not presenting what comes after el hecho de que as a fact. We can use this structure to present facts, but in this case, we're using it to present something more subjective. Even though the clip was cut short, it's clear that he's presenting this in a subjective way because of es algo que at the end of it. So this shows that he's not stating you do it every day, you prepared this for us. You're saying something subjective about that, which he says in the next part after es algo que. So in this case, this is why we need the subjunctive to be used. Also, after luego preparan, he said luego preparan todo esto para nosotros. A more natural way would be perhaps to use the present perfect. Nos hayan preparado, again, still subjunctive, but nos hayan preparado todo esto, right? Since it's something that they have just done rather than something that they are currently doing right in that moment. And also moving instead of para nosotros, just say nos hayan preparado rather than hayan preparado esto para nosotros. So let's look at the next phrase.
Y eso. Y algunas anécdotas más y también la gente que conocí durante el camino inca.
Right, so in this case, there's another couple of points with making sure that between the vowels, even between words, there's no stopping of the air, there's no break, like with camino inca. No, camino inca should be camino inca, right? So here, the vowels themselves were still slightly English kind of vowels in inca, but he did join them to camino in a much more natural way. Additionally, when he says algunas anécdotas, the S at the end of algunas should move over to the beginning of the next word, anécdotas. And this is because the more natural way when a Spanish word starts with a vowel and it comes after one that starts with a consonant is that the consonant moves to the next syllable, since the most natural syllable type is consonant vowel. And this is how Spanish speakers seem to speak so fast, because they're constantly doing this even across the word boundary. So you can't really tell where all the words are just by any breaks, because there aren't any breaks in the middle. So instead of algunas anécdotas, it should be algunas anécdotas, with the S moved over to in front of the A. Additionally, in the word anécdotas, it sounded more like anécdotas, right? So the D is a very important sound in Spanish, and it's different than in English. So the D, when we pronounce it in English, we have a D with the tongue touching the very top of our mouth, which we call the alveolus. In Spanish, it's not like this, it's actually more dental. So we have the D pronounced with it touching the back of the top teeth. De, like this, right? And when he said anécdotas, it sounded more like he was using the English D. And this doesn't match up with a lot of what he said in the rest of the things that we've heard, since he seems to be doing the D very well throughout, except it's slightly noticeable here that in anécdotas it sounds a bit more alveolar. When he pronounced también, he again reduced the E to more of an I. So he says también, and he needs to make sure that the E is, the tongue is in the right position and the mouth is open wide enough, like a very big smile, E. In the word la gente, when he pronounced it, it sounded more like la gente, which is using the English h rather than the Spanish h. So the difference here is that the English one is an aspirated sound, which is just very far back in the mouth, ha sound. And in Spanish instead, it uses the back of the tongue touching the roof of the mouth here at the back. Okay. It doesn't have to be really strong, but it is noticeable in comparison to the English ha. Of course, it is true that in certain Spanish dialects, they also have this style of ha for the k sound. But that does not match up with the rest of what the things he was saying. So it's really not the accent that he has been learning. So it probably would be worthwhile for him to try and learn to do the more general standard version in Spanish. Okay. Alright, so let's look at the next bit.
Comenzando al principio, nos tuvimos que levantar a las 4:30 de la mañana, y digo nosotros porque yo estaba allí con dos amigos haciendo el camino Inca.
Comenzando al principio, very good, joining all the vowels. Comenzando al, he pronounced that very well. And the only thing I wanted to say about this part was he said principio. So again, using a bit more of an English e instead of the Spanish y. So it's beneficial here to make sure that the tongue is further enough back and also with the mouth closed and wide enough, y instead of e. So not principio, but principio. Okay, the next bit, nos tuvimos que levantar. Right, so here he actually did the E very, very well in tuvimos. So again, he's very capable of doing it. It's just not something he does in every single position. And que levantar, right? So when he pronounced the E in que and levantar, it sounded more like an open like in English, rather than E as it should be. So as I said before, I need to make sure that the tongue is a bit further up, closing a bit more air, and the also a bit further back than in English, so it's an E. Que levantar. A las 4:30 de la mañana. So he said a las 4:30 de la mañana. A las 4:30 de la mañana. So what we need to make sure is again that the a, like in media, is not reduced to an a. He doesn't really do it very often, which is very good, since us English speakers, generally when we speak another language, and such as Spanish, we reduce all of the vowels or too many of the vowels, but he really does this only very, very rarely and with the a near the end of the words. So with experiencia and also with media. So we need to make sure that it's experiencia and media. Okay, so let's look at the next part.
Y la verdad es que esa mañana fue brutal porque la noche anterior alguien me robó el celular y eso es otra historia.
So, y la verdad es que esa mañana fue brutal porque la noche anterior alguien me robó el celular y eso es otra historia. So, quite natural phrasing, although one of the things that you could change is perhaps the verb conjugation here. Since he's talking about something that had happened the night before, it would be more natural to use the pluscuamperfecto. So instead of la noche anterior, alguien me robó el celular, right? Instead, la noche anterior, alguien me había robado el celular. And additionally, when he pronounced noche anterior, it sounded more like noche interior. So, of course, interior, anterior, they're very similar words, so it's easy to get them mixed up. But I just need to make sure that he gets the correct vowel at the start, the a. And when he said, eso es otra historia, the joining of the vowels up, very, very good. However, the I in historia was also a bit more like in English, historia.
Ya tengo un video explicando lo que pasó esa noche. Siguiendo, desayunamos y luego empezamos el camino Inca.
So the only thing I wanted to mention was the use of siguiendo. So this use here to connect sort of back to saying, oh, back to the original story or carrying on or something like this is not the most natural way to do this in Spanish. So a better way to do it would be perhaps to say después or luego o volviendo a la historia o pero bueno, volvemos a la historia, something like this.
Y sí, la verdad es que por lo general el día 1 fue un día tranquilo con respecto al senderismo.
Right, this bit was very good. He did enunciate a bit less. So when he said por lo general, it sounded like he wasn't pronouncing the sounds quite as clearly as normal, but it still sounded very natural and still sounded good. So the only thing I could criticize in this case, if I could criticize anything, would be to make sure that it is consistent throughout your whole speech. But people don't usually do that anyway, so there's no real issue here. When he says el día uno fue un día tranquilo, again, what we noticed with the D before is coming back. So it sounds more like an English D. He said el día uno, rather than el día uno. So making sure that the D in Spanish is more dental rather than alveolar, making sure that the tongue is touching the back of the front teeth.
Y realmente lo que me impactó en el día 1 del Camino Inca fueron los porteadores. Y para que te hagas una idea, tuvieron que hacer senderismo mientras que llevaron una bolsa de 30 kilos.
So, very good this part again. As I want to say, all of it is very good. I'm being extremely picky, especially with the pronunciation, but that's the point of the video. So let's keep going. When he said realmente, it sounded a bit more like realmente, right? So in English, obviously, we say real, but in Spanish, we need to make sure that the E is very clear, realmente. Mientras que llevaron una bolsa de 30 kilos, right? So what he said was, mientras que llevaron una bolsa de 30 kilos, instead of emphasizing llevaron, it's probably better to emphasize kilos, right? So, because we want to stress not the fact that they carried a bag, but the fact that they carried a 30-kilogram bag. So that's why it's more natural to perhaps say, mientras que llevaron una bolsa de 30 kilos, exaggerating the 30 kilos part rather than the llevaron part. Alright, so when he said, para que te hagas una idea, it's a very good choice of a phrase and very natural. Tuvieron que, he said tuvieron que, rather than tuvieron que, again with the e being too open and forward. Okay, so just a quick bit on the phrasing here. Mientras que is usually used for contrast. So instead of talking about two actions that happen at the same time, like he's doing here, where it should be mientras llevaron una bolsa de 30 kilos o mientras llevaban una bolsa de 30 kilos.
Y cuando llegaron al fin, antes de nosotros, no pararon y establecieron nuestras tiendas de campaña y cocinaron nuestra comida.
Not much to comment on the pronunciation here, but a couple bits on the wording. So cuando llegaron al fin, so fin generally means a more figurative or abrupt end to something, right? So in this case, if we're talking about like the end of the line or the end of the route, not the actual finish of the route was blocked, or the actual route itself, like the path, just ended, so you couldn't complete the route. So you say el fin del camino. But in this case, he actually means reaching their destination, reaching the end of the whole route that they had just been on. So in this case, it would be better to say llegaron al final o al final del camino, right?
Es un esfuerzo y un trabajo increíble, su estado de forma, su mentalidad y, sobre todo, su amabilidad.
So very good intonation here, listing multiple things. That's one of the most important patterns of intonation you can do. So for each thing, your voice goes up at the end, su estado de forma, su mentalidad, y sobre todo, su amabilidad. Additionally, in the es un esfuerzo y un trabajo increíble, when he said that, it needs to be more of a stress on the E. So the E, since it's between two vowels here, becomes more like a consonant. So es un esfuerzo y un, rather than es un esfuerzo y un. So it's a very subtle difference, but it needs to pronounce more as if it's just like attached to the word yeah, rather than English yeah. Additionally, it should instead be es un esfuerzo y un trabajo increíbles. And again, this is very picky, but since he's talking about two things, they're both incredible, he needs to make sure that the adjective is agreeing with the plural combination of el esfuerzo y el trabajo. With su amabilidad, so when he said that, he again used the glossal stop and pause between su amabilidad. So he said su amabilidad. And a more natural thing to do would be to go from one vowel to the next smoothly. Su amabilidad, not su amabilidad.
Otra cosa que es graciosa es que cuando llegamos a un punto de espero o de encuentro, ellos ya obviamente estuvieron ahí y cuando llegamos, ellos nos aplaudieron. Y eso fue muy raro porque obviamente ellos ya habían llegado y habían tomado una bolsa de 30 kilos mientras que solo estuvimos haciendo senderismo.
Alright, so actually very well expressed in this part. There's just a few small points. So again, when it's punto de espera, it should be espera instead of espero. So just a small vocabulary slip up. But when he does de espera, he uses again the glottal stop. So de espera, it should be de espera. So the vowels should flow into each other. And in this case, it seems, since they're both the same, it's more like a longer e. And in quick speech, it might even only be one e, like te espera. When he said ellos ya, instead of ellos ya, it's again going back to the ya, which needs more tension than in English. So instead of ellos ya, like using the English ya, the tongue comes much more forward, ya, and has more tension. Ellos ya rather than ellos ya. When he said obviamente, there's a couple of problems with the vowels here. So when he said obviamente, it sounded more like obviamente. So the a needs to be much clearer, like the same thing it was with media and experiencia. Need to make sure that the a at the end is quite clear. And also with mente, we need to make sure that the e is more Spanish rather than the English open and central one. It should be further back. E. Going back to the y sound that he did, not quite right in ellos ya, but now when he says subieron allí, when he said allí, it was perfect. So he's definitely capable of doing this sound. It just needs to be made more conscious of doing it all the time. When he said cuando is again another example of too much aspiration in the g sound. Ellos nos aplaudieron. So again here with the s in nos and the start of aplaudieron, the s needs to move over to the first syllable of the word afterwards, since it starts with a vowel. So not nos aplaudieron, but nos aplaudieron. Ya habían llegado. The first time he pronounced habían, it was much stronger B. So habían, he said habían llegado. But then in the next phrase afterwards, habían tomado, he pronounces the B perfectly well. So just being wary that the B sometimes sounds a bit too strong. When he said senderismo, the E is again more like an I. So a few recurring problems, very small issues, but a few recurring problems throughout that are usually to do with just a couple of sounds that are usually quite difficult. Now looking at a couple of grammar points for this last section. Otra cosa que es graciosa es que, a simpler way of saying this would probably just be otra cosa graciosa es que. There's no need to do que es when you already can just put the adjective right next to the noun, cosa graciosa. Additionally, the tenses used in this section could be improved since it's more natural to use the imperfect. Since in this case, we're not necessarily talking about the singular time that they arrived at a waiting point. We're talking about throughout the route, each time they arrived at a waiting point, they were there before us and they clapped for us, right? So by the way he phrased it, it seems like this is what he meant, but it doesn't quite match up with the tenses that he used, since he used preterite, which suggests that it only had happened once. You would have to say, cuando llegábamos a un punto de espera o de encuentro, ya obviamente habían subido allí. So now we're using the anterior past again, habían subido, because we are comparing the two events in time. We're saying they arrived there before we did, so we need to make sure we use the anterior past. Habían subido allí. Pero cuando llegábamos nosotros, rather than y cuando llegamos, it's better to use pero to contrast. And additionally with the contrast, when we're using nosotros, it's important to put that to make sure they know that we're comparing them arriving to us arriving. Nos aplaudían y eso no tenía mucho sentido. So he said, eso fue muy raro, but a more natural way of saying would probably be, eso no tenía mucho sentido, porque ellos ya habían llegado y habían llevado una bolsa de 30 kilos. So he said habían tomado una bolsa de 30 kilos. But I think a more natural verb to be used here would be llevar. Since they carried it and we're talking about them having brought it with them, it's more natural to use llevar. Mientras que nosotros solo hacíamos senderismo. Instead of using the preterite continuous, estuvimos haciendo, it's better to use just the simple imperfect. It's also possible to use the imperfect continuous, estábamos haciendo, but it's not as necessary here, and you can just say hacíamos. So the final thing I wanted to comment about this section was the use of personal pronouns, right? So in Spanish, these pronouns like yo, tú, nosotros, ellos, they are optional, right? But they have specific uses. They're used to clarify when the conjugation is not immediately obvious who we're talking about. Could be ellos o ustedes, they use the same conjugation. So to make the contrast, we need to put the pronoun to show exactly who we are talking about. Or it could be just to simply imply a contrast. Perhaps I was just talking about them, now I'm talking about you. or they arrived, then we arrived. So in English, what we do is we stress the pronoun. They arrived, then we arrived, or they arrived before we did, right? So we would stress the pronoun. In Spanish, instead of stressing the pronoun, what you do is you simply use the pronoun, because without the pronoun, you can still understand what's happening, but you just don't have this idea of contrast. Changing slightly when he used it, cuando llegábamos a un punto de espera o de encuentro, dice, ellos ya obviamente subieron allí. So the use of ellos here is not necessary, since it's already clear by the conjugation that we are talking about ellos, and we're not comparing any two actions, right? We are afterwards, but initially we haven't compared anything yet. So ya obviamente habían subido allí, and then, pero cuando llegamos nosotros, so now it's important to add in the pronoun since we got the contrast. So llegamos nosotros, and also for the same reason as before, it's better to put it at the end since this emphasizes us more. By putting at the end that it's the thing that we're talking about is not the fact that we arrived, but the fact that we arrived after them. So compared to them, we arrived after, the more natural emphasis would be to put the nosotros at the end of this part of the phrase. So cuando llegamos nosotros, nos aplaudían, right? So here we're not comparing anything, and it's obvious from the conjugation that it's ellos. So we don't need to say ellos nos aplaudían. It would be a bit redundant. So nos aplaudían, y eso no tenía mucho sentido porque ellos ya habían llegado, right? So now we use ellos since we're now talking about the fact about arriving. Since we were already comparing to us arriving after them, it's important to use the pronoun ellos to further show that contrast. Ellos ya habían llegado y habían llevado. So here we don't need to use ellos since it was just mentioned in the part before and we haven't had any change of pronoun. So habían llevado una bolsa de 30 kilos, mientras que, right? So now mientras que, which I said before, mientras que is used for a contrast, right? Mientras is used for two simultaneous actions, but mientras que is used for a contrast. And so here is used it perfectly. The only thing is, since we now have this contrast, it's important to make sure that we use the pronoun afterwards, nosotros. Mientras que nosotros solo hacíamos senderismo, right? So it's, but we were only doing hiking, right? Rather than carrying 30-kilogram bags with us. Okay, so that's going to be it for my review. We only got through about 2 minutes of this video, so if you want to hear the rest of the story, please go and check it out using the link in the description. Overall, what I want to say is that Spanish with Rors Spanish is very, very good. It's very high level. And its pronunciation overall is very good, especially the consonants and additionally also the vowels. It's not always 100% consistent, but it's something that he can improve on over time. And he definitely is very capable of pronouncing all of the sounds correctly. And I think I didn't come across any sound that he pronounced wrong every single time he said it. It's only sometimes that he pronounces it wrong and other times that he pronounces it right. So it's just a question of becoming even more consistent. But a good example of something that he does well is the R sound. Since the R sound for us English speakers is a lot of work to learn, and for him that he does it really, really, really well, it's definitely a big bonus point for his Spanish. And overall, his phrasing and his fluency is very good, especially in the clip where he's talking to that group of people. It sounds very, very fluid and very good natural speech, as well as the fact that he's speaking obviously in a pressured environment, like I mentioned. So overall, I hope you learned something from this video, and please leave a like and a comment if you want me to review someone else, leave in a suggestion, and thank you for watching.